Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The first thing I remember is the way the champagne glass felt in my hand, too cold, like I was holding a warning and didn't even realize it. My fingers were stiff from gripping it too tightly, and I wasn't even drinking. The smile on my face had been rehearsed 100 times in the mirror, that half-sincere smirk you wear at events where people talk more about the catering than the couple. It was our engagement party, supposedly about Evan and me, and yet, from the moment we arrived, it had all started to feel like a show where we weren't even in the cast. My mother had booked the venue. Without asking. A converted barn with chandeliers and those ugly little LED fairy lights that made the place look like it was trying too hard to be charming. My father handled the guest list. That meant half the people there were business acquaintances who called me sweetheart and kiddo, and none of them had ever bothered to learn my name. But I knew the role I was supposed to play. I'd played it my whole life. The quiet one, the responsible one, the one who paid for her own college without asking, who never complained when Zach needed to be bailed out one more time. I was the scaffolding that held up my brother's tower of dreams, even when it was leaning so far sideways it should have fallen years ago. I saw it coming that night. Not the exact words, but the setup. My mom was fluttering around, laughing too loudly, dragging people toward the dessert table and bragging about how homemade the tarts were. They weren't. My dad had that glint in his eye he always got when he was about to perform. And Zach? He arrived late, of course, wearing sunglasses indoors and greeting people like he was the damn guest of honor. My fiancé Evan watched it all with the same calm, almost amused expression he always wore around my family. He'd warned me, told me to brace myself, told me more than once, you don't owe these people your silence. But I kept hoping, stupidly, that this time would be different. Then the clinking started. My mother, red wine already staining the inside rim of her teeth, called for attention with the back of a butter knife against her champagne flute. The room grew quiet in that awkward way parties do when everyone knows someone's about to say something inappropriate, but we all pretend to enjoy it anyway. She started with pleasantries, how proud she was, how thrilled to welcome Evan to the family, how beautiful I looked. That kind of sugary crap that always made me feel like a Barbie doll on a shelf. Then her voice changed. It got that proud, performative pitch that she usually reserved for talking about Zach's potential. And we're just so grateful, she said, pausing for effect like a bad soap actress, to everyone who contributed tonight to make this celebration possible. Your generosity means the world to us, and to Zach. The air sucked right out of my lungs. I didn't even fully register what she was saying yet, just the name. Zach, she continued, smiling like she was announcing a Nobel Prize winner. Because after much discussion, we've decided that all contributions from tonight, gifts, cards, and donations, will go toward Zach's new business venture. He's got such a bright future ahead, and we just know he's going to make us all proud. The silence in the room was polite, almost impressed. People clapped. Not everyone, but enough to make me feel like I was the crazy one for freezing in place. I looked around. Some people nodded, some raised glasses, and a few gave Zach that warm, patronizing attaboy look, like he was some scruffy underdog clawing his way up from the dirt. But no one looked at me. Not even my parents. They hadn't just hijacked our party. They'd rebranded it. In public. In front of everyone I'd invited to celebrate our love, our future, they had handed the spotlight to my brother and told everyone he was the one worth investing in. My fiancé didn't move. That's what I remember most. Evan didn't flinch. He just stood next to me, his glass still in his hand, that soft, unreadable smile playing on his face like he'd seen this movie before and already knew how it ended. I could hear the blood in my ears, like waves crashing against a wall I was trying not to kick down. My hands trembled. I didn't say anything, because if I started, I wasn't sure I'd stop. I wasn't sure I'd stop screaming. Zach grinned, like a little boy handed an ice cream cone and told the world was his. He raised his glass toward my mother, winked and said, "Thanks, Ma. I'll make you proud." And I, the bride-to-be, the supposed star of the show, stood there like an extra in my own damn celebration. I felt Evan shift slightly beside me. He leaned in, his voice so low only I could hear it. "It's time," he said. Just 2 words. And somehow I knew exactly what he meant. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. This was exactly what it looked like. A public reminder that no matter what I built, my family would always see me as the scaffolding for Zach's latest mess. And Evan? Evan wasn't just here to smile politely anymore. He'd come with a plan. And we were just getting started. Evan didn't raise his voice, didn't clear his throat or ask for silence. He just reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket, the one he only wore for moments that mattered, and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope that instantly looked too serious for a party. It had weight, not just in its size or the stiff paper, but in the way he held it like a man holding a loaded truth he was about to hand over without a flinch. The envelope didn't belong in a room filled with sugar cookies and champagne flutes and people pretending they didn't see the train wreck barreling down the track. It belonged in a courtroom, oral reading, or somewhere people knew to brace themselves. The moment his hand emerged, the air around us shifted. Not everyone noticed. Some were still chatting. Some probably assumed it was a card for my mother, maybe a late RSVP or a sweet gesture. But my father's eyes caught it immediately. He straightened a little, the way a man does when he senses he's being challenged, but isn't sure what kind of game he's in yet. My mother didn't stop smiling, not at first. Her mouth stayed frozen in that too white grin as Evan walked, not rushed, not slow, just steady, across the room and handed the envelope directly to her. She looked down at it like it was something foreign, not quite understanding what he expected her to do with it, maybe hoping it was a joke or some last-minute speech we hadn't told her about. But Evan didn't offer explanations. He just said, quietly, "You should read that now." The hush was gradual, but it spread like wildfire. People near us stopped their small talk. Glasses hovered midair. Someone dropped a fork, and it clattered too loudly. My heart was thudding so hard I thought people would hear it through my dress. I had dreamed of this moment, or something like it, but in those dreams I was the one standing tall and delivering the line that shattered the illusion. Evan had taken that weight from me not because I couldn't do it, but because he knew I had carried too damn much already. My mother finally opened the envelope, her nails catching on the edge like they didn't want her to see what was inside. She pulled out the first sheet, then another, and another. Page after page of cold, clear facts. Bank statements, receipts, transcripts of wire transfers. Copies of checks I had written from the age of 21 until just 2 years ago, tuition payments, rent deposits, grocery stubs. Flights booked. Bail money wired. Startup cash sent with notes that said, "Don't tell Mom and Dad." Her eyes scanned the numbers, and with each passing second, her smile began to decay, not all at once, but like something wilting under a hot light. My father leaned over her shoulder and read faster. He was always good with numbers, and I saw the exact second his brain caught up to what he was seeing. His lips tightened. His jaw set. That vein on the side of his temple pulsed once, a small tell that only people who grew up watching him knew meant he was furious, but couldn't figure out who he was allowed to blame. Then came the letter. One sheet, cream stock, simple typeface. Evan had written it. I'd edited it once. Then twice. Then a third time at 2 in the morning after a call from Zach asking if I could just float him $5,000 until next quarter. The letter listed, in bullet points, every instance my parents had redirected resources, shifted support, or outright dismissed my needs in favor of helping Zach find himself. It ended with one sentence. One that took me years to say and 3 seconds to read. This is the last check your daughter will ever have to write for your son. No drama. No exclamation point. Just a fact that landed like a punch in the chest. My mother looked up at me, her mouth opening but not forming words. My father set the paper down with a precision that made my skin crawl. the way a man places something he thinks might explode. Silence held the room in its teeth. No one moved. And then, of course, Zach laughed. Not the nervous kind of laugh you let slip when you're cornered and have nothing left but bravado. This was a real, chest-deep laugh. Like the whole thing was a comedy special he hadn't seen coming. He leaned against the table, wiped his eyes, and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Damn, Claire. You've been keeping receipts like a tax auditor." People shifted uncomfortably. Someone let out a short, choked chuckle. My stomach turned. Zach didn't stop there. "So what is this?" he asked, stepping forward with that swagger that only someone raised to believe they'll always land on their feet can pull off. Some kind of engagement party roast? A financial intervention? Evan didn't blink. He stood there, tall and patient, watching Zach the way a lion watches a clown stumble around its cage, knowing the bars won't hold forever. "This isn't for you," Evan said, calm and cutting, "but you're welcome to read it too." My mother looked like she might cry, which stunned me more than anything else. But they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of embarrassment, not over what they'd done, but over being exposed. She wasn't ashamed of the favoritism. She was ashamed people could see it now. I finally spoke, my voice low and steady. "You spent my engagement party raising money for a man who hasn't worked a full-time job in 10 years. My father opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Evan, then me, then back at the papers. I almost expected him to tear them up, to demand we leave. But he didn't. He simply stood there, swallowed hard, and said nothing. And in that silence, I realized something broke. Not loudly, not with screaming, but with facts, with proof, with an envelope full of truth they couldn't spin, twist, or bury beneath some sentimental nonsense about family always sticking together. Evan stepped back beside me, slid his hand into mine, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "They'll never forget this." And he was right. There's a kind of forgetting that doesn't happen all at once, but instead wears you down in quiet layers, like tidewater eating away at the edges of a rock until one day you look down and realize you've been smoothed out to something unrecognizable. That's what it was like growing up next to Zach, not in competition with him, not in conflict, but in some blurry shadow he always seemed to cast without even noticing. From the beginning, he was loud and charming and magnetic in that way people mistake for leadership. I was quieter, sharper maybe, but forgettable in the way reliable people often are. I was 12 the first time I really learned what it meant to come second, and not because someone told me I was less important, but because the piano teacher I loved suddenly stopped showing up. I'd been practicing every day, trying to master Clair de Lune with fingers too small for the chords, and then one night at dinner, Mom announced that Zach had been accepted into some fancy summer camp 2 states over, wilderness training, character building. "A real opportunity for growth," she said. I didn't ask questions, because by then I already understood that questions from me didn't change much. A week later, the piano teacher was gone, and no one brought her up again. When I was 18, I juggled 2 jobs, one at the bookstore on campus, and one waiting tables at a chain restaurant where the uniform made me feel like a cocktail shrimp. Just to afford rent in a shared apartment with peeling linoleum and a bathroom that smelled like mildew no matter how often I cleaned it. Zach was 20 then and already back home after his 3rd failed attempt at college, blaming bad professors and stifling environments for his GPA that couldn't crack a 2.0. He'd sleep till noon, burn through my parents' Netflix account, and talk a lot about hustle culture while never holding a job longer than 6 weeks. He crashed my car once, not a fancy one, not even decent by most standards, but mine, and when I found it parked 2 streets away with the bumper half torn off, he just laughed and said, "I'll make it up to you, swear." My parents paid for his insurance for 4 more years after that, but somehow the deductible on my policy went up and never came back down. I didn't ask for help. I just took on another shift. By the time I was 24, I had started sending Zach money occasionally, small amounts at first, then more when he launched his startup. which was just a renamed affiliate marketing scam that looked impressive in a PowerPoint and fell apart the second anyone asked questions. He told me he needed help with the initial costs, some licensing fee, inventory, whatever it was, and I sent the money. Not because I believed in the business, but because I believed that if I didn't, no one else would. That if I stopped supporting him, I'd be blamed for his fall. Evan came into my life around then, and from the start, he saw it all. He never mocked me for helping, never told me to stop, at least not directly, just asked little things like, "Why doesn't he get a job?" or "Have your parents ever thanked you for all this?" I didn't have answers, because you don't realize how far you've gone until someone hands you a map and says, "Hey, this is where you started." When Evan asked to see the receipts, I hesitated. Not because I wanted to hide anything, but because it meant admitting out loud, to someone I loved, just how deep the cuts went. We sat down one weekend, pulled up bank records and email chains and text messages, and laid them out like pieces of a puzzle that spelled out a lifetime of being the safety net no one ever acknowledged. Evan printed them, organized them, highlighted what mattered. And then he looked at me and said, "This isn't about proving them wrong. It's about freeing you." The funny thing is, I never really hated Zach. You can't hate someone for taking what's handed to them, especially when they've been raised to believe they're entitled to it. But what I started to hate, what I began to burn over quietly, was the silence. The way no one ever said thank you. The way I became invisible not in spite of what I gave, but because of it. So when that envelope opened at the engagement party, and the truth started spilling out page by page, it wasn't vengeance. It was exposure. And when Zach started laughing, not in shame, but in full, grinning amusement, it confirmed everything I already knew. He had never once thought of any of it as a debt. To him, I was just the support beam in a house he thought he owned. That's when I heard her voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs like a knife through butter. Aunt Carol, Mom's older sister. The one who never married, never had kids, and never, ever held back her opinions. "Claire," she said from across the room, loud enough that the cluster of guests near the wine bar stopped sipping and turned their heads, "is that true?" For a split second, I thought about lying. I thought about brushing it off, making a joke, letting the tension break so people could go back to eating their mini quiches and pretending this wasn't happening. But something in me locked in place. I looked straight at her and said, yes. Every word of it. And just like that, the party became something else entirely. There's a moment at every party, a real one, not the polite kind you plan on Pinterest, but the kind where people's masks finally slip, where everything begins to unravel with a kind of slow, hungry precision. And you suddenly realize nothing that happens after will be forgotten. That moment hit hard, sharp as a cracked wine glass under someone's heel, when Aunt Carol's voice broke the polished quiet of the room and turned our engagement celebration into something closer to a trial. Her words, still hanging in the air, were laced with disbelief, but also something sharper underneath, maybe anger, maybe guilt, or maybe just the bitter sting of someone realizing they'd been played too. "You mean we were giving money to Zach?" she asked again, louder now, as though repetition might force someone to explain the joke. Her eyes were already glossy, though not from the wine. Aunt Carol never drank, and she never forgot when someone lied to her, either. Before I could speak again, one of my cousins, Josh, the middle one, the one who always called me the responsible one like it was a diagnosis, tossed his napkin onto the table and muttered something like "unbelievable," before walking out with his wife trailing behind, heels clacking fast across the hardwood floor. I watched them leave, wondering how many others would follow, how many were thinking the same thing, that this wasn't a party, not anymore, and maybe never had been. My mother's face had frozen into a kind of high society panic, that blend of forced smile and wide eyes that says, everything is fine, but screams, fix this before anyone else finds out. She stepped toward Aunt Carol with a hand raised in explanation, but her voice cracked as she tried to speak. "We didn't mean for this to get so public," Carol snapped, not even waiting for her to finish. "I gave $200 in that card. assuming it was for a wedding, not to float your son's next failure. Zach, dear God. Zach leaned back against the edge of a table like this was some game show, and he was waiting for the final question to cash in his prize. He ran a hand through his over-gelled hair, looked around at the shifting faces, and smirked like none of it mattered. Okay, he said, holding up his hands like some kind of misunderstood prophet. This is getting way out of hand. You're all acting like I robbed a bank. It was a misunderstanding, all right? Mom just said she'd help with a little support, and people were generous, and look, it's not like I asked for it. You didn't have to, I said, the words sliding out before I even realized they'd formed. You never do. He raised his eyebrows, tilted his head, and gave me that fake confused look that used to make teachers forgive his missed assignments and girls fall back into his bed after he ghosted them for a week. Claire, come on. Don't do this here. This is exactly where it needs to happen, I said, more to myself than anyone else, my voice steady in a way it hadn't been in years. Because here, people can finally see what I've seen since I was old enough to understand that love in our house was conditional and mostly directed one way. My father finally stepped in, his voice low and firm in that old-world dad tone that still carried weight even after all these years. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. That's enough, he said, aiming it at both of us, but mostly at me. You don't air family business in front of guests. Evan, who had been silent so far, calm as a still pond before the storm hits, stepped forward now. His movements always had intention, never rushed, never dramatic, just precise, like someone placing the final piece in a puzzle everyone's been too afraid to complete. There's one more thing, he said, pulling a second slip of paper from his inside pocket, not as thick as the envelope from earlier, but still serious, still official. Since there's confusion about what this party was actually funding, let's clear something up. He unfolded the paper with deliberate care and handed it to my father, who took it with the same caution you'd use picking up a wasp you're not sure is dead. His eyes scanned it, and his jaw tightened the way it always did before a fight he knew he wouldn't win. It's the receipt, Evan said, for our wedding venue. Paid in full. 3 months ago. No assistance. No family contributions. Just Claire. The silence after that wasn't shock anymore. It was something colder, heavier, like the first seconds after a verdict is read aloud in a courtroom. My father stared at the paper as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less humiliating. My mother's hand fluttered up to her mouth like she might be sick, though I knew she wouldn't be. That would take a kind of guilt I'd long stopped expecting. Zach let out a dry laugh and muttered, "Well, la-dida." That was when my father finally looked at me, eyes narrowed not with confusion, but with something closer to accusation. His voice, when it came, was softer than I expected but laced with that tight control I'd grown up afraid of. You went behind our backs? I didn't look away. I didn't blink. No, I said, my voice sharp enough to slice through the last threads of illusion. You were never behind me to begin with. The room stayed quiet, no one daring to break the spell. For the first time in a long time, I felt taller than every person in the room, not because of what I'd said, but because I'd stopped waiting for them to give me permission to say it. And even then I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the first crack in the wall. The party ended the way most illusions do, not with applause or laughter or any kind of clean finale, but with half-eaten cake, abandoned wine glasses, and people making quiet, awkward exits like guests sneaking out of a crime scene. The music had stopped an hour earlier, and no one had noticed. The fairy lights strung across the rafters flickered unevenly, casting long, shaky shadows across the floor, like the whole room had finally gotten tired of pretending. By the time the last person left, Aunt Carol, muttering under her breath and still shaking her head, only 4 of us remained. My mother, my father, Evan, and me. We didn't speak for a while. Not until the last door clicked shut and the echo of laughter from the parking lot faded into silence. Evan and I sat down first, side by side on one of those whitewashed wooden benches that looked pretty but made your spine ache after 15 minutes. My father stood behind a table, arms crossed like a man trying to shield something invisible. My mother sat across from us, her hands folded neatly in her lap, still wearing the smile she'd plastered on during dessert, only now it had hardened into something brittle. No one shouted. There was no explosion, no slammed fists or dramatic breakdowns. The chaos had already happened in public, so now we were left with the ruins. And ruins demand reckoning, not noise. My mother was the first to speak, her voice quiet and overly rehearsed, like someone apologizing through a press release. We didn't mean to upset you, she said, not looking at me, but we thought it made sense. Zach's had a harder path. He's had his struggles. Struggles, she said, like it was a noble burden he carried instead of a long list of unpaid debts and missed opportunities. I didn't answer right away because I knew, if I did, the words would come out sharper than I meant. Evan placed a hand gently on my knee, not to calm me down, but to let me know I didn't have to speak if I didn't want to. My father exhaled and took a few slow steps closer, still crossing and uncrossing his arms like he couldn't figure out whether to brace or explain. It's not that we don't appreciate you, Claire, he said, and I almost laughed right then, because what the hell kind of appreciation looks like systematically overlooking your daughter while bankrolling your son's 5th comeback? I stared at him, not coldly, but without blinking. You always thought I'd be fine, I said, and I meant it without malice. Just the plain, awful truth. That's the lie, isn't it? You never helped me because you assumed I'd survive. The words landed like a weight on the room. My mother's eyes glistened slightly, but she blinked too fast for the tears to fall. My father sat down slowly, the way men do when they finally realize they're not holding the higher ground anymore. You were always the strong one, he said, a whisper of admiration buried inside the excuse. You never asked for help. No, I said, because I knew it wouldn't come. The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It was something closer to resignation, like they were finally beginning to accept that their version of fairness had always been one-sided. After a few long, tense seconds, my mother cleared her throat and reached into her handbag. She pulled out a checkbook, the old-fashioned kind, leather-bound and monogrammed, and without saying another word, she began writing. The pen moved slowly, deliberately, as though she thought that dragging out the motion might soften the meaning. She tore the check gently and slid it across the table toward me. Take this, she said, voice tight but careful. It's not everything we owe you, but it's a start. I didn't even look at the number. I pushed the check back across the table, not with anger, just with finality. I don't want your money, I said, and I meant it. I'd wanted 100 things from them over the years: support, acknowledgement, basic respect, but not this. Not a check scrawled in guilt after a ruined party. Evan, however, picked up the check, glanced at it for a second, then folded it and tucked it neatly into his coat pocket. My mother looked startled, like she'd misread us entirely. You said you didn't want anything, she said, her voice starting to fray at the edges. I don't, I replied, looking at Evan now. But he has something to say. Evan's voice was calm, surgical in its clarity, the kind of tone you'd use to deliver news you didn't enjoy but knew had to be said. We don't want cash. What we want is a commitment, he said. Put it in writing that your estate, everything you leave behind, is split evenly. 50-50. Claire and Zach. Nothing more, nothing less. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. My father looked like he'd swallowed something sharp. My mother's mouth opened slightly, then closed again without a sound. The request wasn't loud, but it echoed like a cannon shot through everything they'd built, because it wasn't just about money. It was about justice, about balance, about finally forcing them to admit that what they had done all these years had been a choice. A conscious one. You're asking us to change our will, my father said slowly, like the idea itself was offensive. I'm asking you to fix what you broke, I said, without flinching. You don't get to pretend this was all fair. You don't get to act like Zach earned more. If you want a relationship with me going forward, that's the price. Not because I care about the money, but because it's the only language you two seem to understand. My mother finally looked directly at me, and for a second, I saw her face crack just slightly. The perfect makeup, the carefully applied charm, it all wavered under the weight of her own realization. Not that I was leaving, but that I meant it. And then, before either of them could speak, a familiar voice drifted in from the doorway behind us. "They already did," Zach said, stepping into the room with that same smug swagger he wore like cologne. "Want to know who it really goes to?" The air dropped 10 degrees, and for the first time all night, my parents looked at him with something that wasn't pity or affection. They looked afraid. The second Zach's voice cut through the stale air of that room, something inside me stopped bracing. It wasn't fear or shock or even anger that hit me first. It was recognition. The kind of recognition you feel when a pattern finally shows itself in full, and you can see every thread connecting back to moments you didn't understand until now. Zach had always known how to walk into a mess and act like he was cleaning it up, even when he was the one who knocked over the first damn domino. This time was no different. He stood in the doorway like a man who had just won something and was only here to collect the trophy, eyes gleaming with the same careless confidence he used to charm teachers, girlfriends, and every investor who fell for the promise of his next big thing. Except now, he wasn't talking about business. Now he was talking about blood, about legacy, about something much uglier than failure, entitlement. "You want to know where all that money goes?" he said, flashing that same lopsided grin he'd used since he was 12 and knew he wouldn't get grounded. It already went. The estate's locked up. I'm the sole beneficiary. There was a pause, not the kind that invites questions, but the kind that lands like a fist in the center of a table. I looked at my father, but he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the floor, and his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack enamel. My mother's hands trembled in her lap, and her face, that face so carefully maintained through decades of denial and decoration, was finally showing cracks. She didn't speak, not right away, but I saw the moisture rising in her eyes like a truth she couldn't hold back anymore. "You told him," I said, more a statement than a question. "You made a will and you told him, but not me." Zach shrugged like it was all just business, no hard feelings. "They figured you'd be fine," he said, glancing toward Evan. "Marrying a guy like him? Come on, Claire. You're gonna be fine." I'm the one who needed it. The weight of that sentence didn't surprise me, but it did settle with finality in my chest, like hearing a truth you'd suspected but hoped was just in your head. It wasn't about what I'd done or hadn't done, how hard I'd worked, how many things I'd let go for the sake of peace. It was about a decision made long ago, probably around the time I was giving up piano lessons so Zach could go to summer camp, and they called it just one of those things. "You needed security," I repeated slowly. "And I didn't." My mother finally spoke, her voice so soft it barely reached the edges of the room. "Claire, you've always been the strong one. We just thought that I'd marry into money." I cut her off, no longer needing to ask. "That I didn't need your help because I had Evan? That I was your backup plan, your safety net, your nothing to worry about daughter?" She nodded once, and the tears finally spilled, but it didn't feel like enough. Not because I wanted more pain from her, I didn't, but because the tears were too late. They always are when they're falling over a decision you already made and justified for years. Evan didn't move or speak for a full minute. He just stood there, eyes locked on my father like he was trying to read the fine print of a betrayal. Then, slowly, calmly, he asked, "Did you even plan on telling her? Or were you just going to let her find out when the ink dried and the house changed hands?" My father looked up then, face tight with something between shame and exhaustion. "We thought we had time," he said, and I almost laughed at the irony of it, as if they'd ever made time for the things that mattered. I looked around the room at the remnants of what was supposed to be a celebration and now resembled a negotiation gone toxic. I thought about every holiday where Zach showed up late and left early but still got the warmest seat at the table. I thought about every apology I gave on his behalf, every loan I quietly forgave, every piece of myself I whittled down so my parents wouldn't have to face the truth about the child they chose to believe in. And then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the weight of it all had finally tipped into something absurd. The inheritance, the favoritism, the way they thought they were helping him while gutting me, it was all so perfectly broken that laughter felt like the only sane response left. "You don't own me anymore," I said, the words landing softly but burning hot, even as I smiled. Not my choices. Not my future. Not even my silence. I turned to Evan, whose eyes never left mine. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His hand reached out for mine like he always did, steady and certain, and I took it. Together, we stood, and without another word, we walked out of the room. But I didn't close the door behind me. I left it slightly open, just enough for the air to get in. Just enough for the truth to keep leaking out. And maybe, just maybe, for them to hear what it sounds like when someone finally stops asking for permission. Outside, under a sky smeared with the last streaks of dusk, the night felt too quiet for what had just happened. Evan lit a cigarette he'd quit years ago, more for the ritual than the smoke, and leaned against the car. "We don't need revenge," he said, his voice low but sure. "We need something better." I looked up at the stars, took a deep breath that didn't catch in my throat for the first time in years, and answered without hesitation. "I want them to remember this night forever." 6 months passed like a blink and a lifetime all at once, and somehow, without ceremony or explanation, the distance between me and my family became a permanent thing I no longer had to explain. There were no late-night calls from my mother, no awkward messages from my father, no fake apologies wrapped in guilt-laced invitations to come home for a Sunday dinner we all knew would be an ambush. The silence was louder than I expected, but it wasn't empty, it was honest. And after years of noise disguised as love, I welcomed the quiet like a long-overdue exhale. Evan and I didn't rush the wedding, but we also didn't stall for anyone else's convenience. We planned it the way we had always imagined, with meaning, intention, and not a single ounce of bullshit. No centerpieces that cost half a paycheck. No second cousins we hadn't seen since someone's funeral. Just people who had shown up for us without conditions or manipulation, people who didn't ask what they were getting out of being there. We chose a small beach on the Oregon coast, the kind that doesn't show up in glossy magazines, but feels like a secret you're lucky to keep. Windy, a little wild, full of gulls that don't apologize for interrupting your vows. I wore a dress I bought secondhand and had tailored to fit my body the way I wanted it to feel, strong, comfortable, entirely my own. There were maybe 20 people there. A few old friends from college, Evan's brother and his husband, my best friend Sam, who flew in from Vermont with a camera around her neck and tears already in her eyes. And there, standing in the center of it all, was Evan, looking at me like he'd been waiting his whole life to see me walk toward him. No aisle, no father to give me away, no pomp and show. Just sand underfoot, the Pacific behind us, and the sound of vows spoken with conviction instead of performance. During the reception, which was really just a bonfire and a cooler of wine, Evan stood, holding a paper cup, and cleared his throat the way he always did when something important was coming, but he didn't want to make a big deal about it. The firelight flickered across his face as he raised his cup and said, "Sometimes, you have to burn bridges just to see who tries to swim across." Everyone laughed, but I felt the weight of it settle inside me like a truth I'd been waiting to hear spoken aloud by someone other than myself. Because it was never about cutting ties for the sake of revenge or drama. It was about clarity, about seeing, finally and without apology, who was willing to meet you in the middle and who expected you to keep swimming back just to drown on their behalf. The night stretched long and sweet. We danced barefoot in the sand to a playlist we made ourselves, ate pie instead of cake, and wrote notes to each other in a journal instead of exchanging rings in front of people who didn't know how to love without conditions. It wasn't perfect. It was better. 3 days later, I sat down with a pen and an envelope. I printed one photo from the wedding, not the posed one, not the kiss or the first dance, but a moment Sam had captured when I was laughing, really laughing, with my feet in the ocean and my dress hitched up around my knees. My hair was a mess, my eyes were squinting, and Evan was holding my hand like we were about to run straight into the waves. I placed the photo into a plain ivory envelope. Then I slid in a printout of the name change form, stamped and official. My new last name, Evan's name. Not because I needed to shed mine, but because I wanted to choose this one. One that had no history of obligation or sacrifice baked into every syllable. One I built, not one I inherited. And then, on a single slip of paper, I wrote one sentence in my own handwriting, steady and clear. We built this without you. No explanation. No apology. No return address. I sealed the envelope, drove to the nearest post office, and mailed it to my parents' house, the same house I once helped repaint after a storm, the same house I used to call home, even though it hadn't felt like one in years. I didn't track it. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't expect anything, and for the first time, I felt no ache in the waiting. Weeks passed. The photos stayed framed on my desk. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that joy can be reclaimed. That piece isn't the absence of conflict. It's the absence of needing approval from people who only ever gave you love on a tight leash. Evan never asked if I wanted to follow up, never pushed me to contact them again. He knew. He always knew. Then, one morning, just as I was sipping coffee and sorting through emails, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen since the night it all came crashing down. Zach. No call. Just a message. You made your point. Now what? I stared at the words for a long time. 8 of them. No punctuation. No apology. No shame. Just the same voice, the same tone, the same damn expectation that the story would go back to normal now, as if all of this had been a detour I'd grown tired of. But the truth was, I wasn't trying to make a point. I was building a life. And he still didn't get it. The message sat there on the screen, 8 words long, short enough to skim, but heavy enough to stop the world for a second. You made your point. Now what? That was it. No, hey, no, I've been thinking, not even the illusion of an apology. Just that, a challenge, a shrug in digital form, a reminder that some people can look at the ruins they helped create and still expect you to help clean up the mess. I stared at it for a while, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because I knew I wouldn't. Not now. Maybe not ever. Zach didn't understand. That had always been the problem. He didn't understand that this wasn't about a single moment, a single party, or even the inheritance he'd claimed like it was his birthright. It was about the years of taking and never once looking back to see what had been left behind. It was about silence rewarded, about sacrifice turned invisible, about love that came with a tally sheet only I was expected to keep quiet about. And now, months later, all he could say was, now what? Like I owed him the next step, the follow-up act, the emotional sequel to a story I'd finally stopped writing for him. I didn't type anything. I didn't even open the full thread. I just stared at that single line, still lit up on my screen, and let it sit there like a stone in a river. Eventually, like everything else in this story, it would get washed downstream. I closed the laptop, pushed it aside, and stood up. Outside the window, the wind had picked up, carrying the kind of chill that always made me feel awake instead of cold. Evan was in the other room, humming under his breath while fixing the leaky faucet I kept forgetting to mention. We lived in a small house, not flashy, not designer perfect, but real. The kind of place where nothing matched on purpose and everything had a story. We'd painted the kitchen together one weekend with music too loud and pizza boxes stacked on the floor. The living room still had boxes we hadn't unpacked, but they didn't bother me anymore. I wasn't waiting to finish before I started enjoying things. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside without saying anything. Evan didn't ask where I was going. He just looked up from the sink, smiled, and gave me that nod, the one that said, I get it. Take your time. The streets were quiet. It was one of those midweek afternoons where the world moves a little slower, where you can hear leaves scrape along the pavement and catch your breath without dodging traffic or noise. I walked without direction, just letting my feet take over, and tried to listen to something I hadn't made space for in a long time, my own voice, the one buried under years of people telling me who I was supposed to be. Did I win? That question lingered longer than Zach's message. Not in the triumphant, scoreboard sense, but in the deeper, murkier way that sticks with you when the fight is over and you're still holding your fists up out of habit. Walking away, building something without them, standing up at that party and showing the receipts, yeah, it all felt like a kind of victory. But victories come with echoes, and I couldn't lie to myself about the ache that still tugged at my ribs when I thought about how easy it had been for them to choose him. How quickly they'd let me go. Was escape enough? Maybe it was. Maybe survival is a form of winning, especially when no one thought you'd leave the cage. Maybe loving someone who doesn't ask you to shrink is the prize. Maybe the fact that I no longer felt like I was chasing approval like a thirsty animal meant I had arrived at something close to peace. Or maybe it was just quieter now because I stopped shouting. I walked to the park where Evan and I had picnicked last fall, before the party, before the will, before I finally said everything out loud. I sat on the bench near the trees, pulled my hands into my sleeves, and watched a little boy chasing a red kite that kept dipping too close to the ground. His dad shouted encouragement from a distance, not pushing, just present, and it struck me how different things could be when people showed up not to fix you, but just to be there. That boy was going to remember how it felt to run with that kite, even when it didn't stay in the air. And somehow, that simple thought made me feel something I hadn't let myself feel in months. Safe. I didn't check my phone. I didn't reread the message. I didn't wonder whether my parents had framed the wedding photo or thrown it in a drawer like a receipt for something they'd rather forget. I didn't care if Zach waited for a response, because the answer wasn't mine to give anymore. Sometimes people ask what closure feels like, and they expect a clean, polished story with a bow on top. But closure isn't neat. It's walking away when the door's still open. It's laughing at a memory without bitterness. It's not needing them to say sorry for you to stop bleeding. I used to think I wanted an apology. Now I just want peace. But sometimes they feel like the same thing. And sometimes they don't.